Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is an exciting one for us here at Real Story Group as we just published the latest edition of our MarTech vendor map, and our founder Tony Byrne is going to walk us through some of the key takeaways of the newest edition of this map. It's something we've been doing for many years. I've been here with Real Story Group for 7 years, and I know it certainly predates me here with RSG. So Tony's going to walk you through some of the key things to consider as you're looking at the latest edition of the MarTech vendor map. But as we get started, I do just want to talk through a couple ground rules here for today's session. Things to think about are, one, we will have time at the end for questions. So if you have questions or feedback that you want to share, you can enter that into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be able to get to those at the end of today's session. Also, for those that are new to our webinars, you will have access to these slides within the next couple of days. Our marketing team will send a follow-up email, so keep an eye out for those. And then the recording will also be available on our website, so you can certainly keep an eye out for that. And for our subscribers on the line, you're certainly the backbone of our business, and thank you very much for being customers of ours. You can take a look at any of our previous webinars in your subscriber library. So keep an eye out for that as well. I do want to provide you with a little bit more background about Real Story Group, as I see a number of new folks on the line with us today. We're a little bit different than the traditional analyst firms that you may be familiar with, as we don't necessarily believe in these mystical quadrants and waves that are sometimes published that are, here's the best vendors, here's the worst vendor. The way we look at it is, what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do? And that's the way that we evaluate each of the different vendors that we look at. The other thing to think about as you're walking through today's presentation with Tony is that we never work for any of these vendors that we evaluate, okay? We only sit on the buy side of the table, and we only have your best interest in mind. So we don't speak at any vendor conferences or write white papers for them or give them any sort of quid pro quo. If they subscribe to our research, we'll say all these fluffy things about them, okay? We're going to give you the hard-hitting critiques about what they do well and what they don't do so well and where they might fall short for you. So keep that in mind as you're going through today's presentation. And Tony, I'm going to kick things over to you to walk through today's agenda. Tony?
Great. Thanks, Scott. I always look forward to this annual presentation because it gives us a chance to kind of step back and say, hey, what's happening in the marketplace at large, and what does you as kind of a MarTech technology or stack leader, what are some kind of key trends for you to think about? So I'm going to be talking about 5 of those trends, but first we'll introduce you to the map itself. So this is a new version. You can download it from our site at the URL that you see at the bottom. realstorygroup.com/vendor map. And, it's always a cartographic challenge for us to fit all the different vendors here. You see the vendor names in gray and then in colored, and the different metro lines or subway lines here represent different marketplaces. And, as always, there's a diversity of vendors, including those who purport to sell multiple different solutions and those that are point solutions. These are highly fragmented marketplaces. New this year is the addition of the salmon line for marketing attribution and analytics, and then the new brown line, which is personalization vendors. And I'll have a lot to say about personalization a little bit later in our discussion, but this just really underscores the complexity I think that many of you are facing as you think about what are the different capabilities you need on the one hand, and then how do those match up against what's at offer in the marketplace. And so this was just our way to visualize the different vendors that we evaluate in what Scott quite appropriately described as our hard-hitting vendor evaluation research. So we produce this every year, typically updated mid-year, and this is this year's version. So without further ado, let's get into what we think are the 5 key takeaways. First is 2 really kind of opposing forces. And I was talking about this yesterday with my colleague and fellow researcher Apoorv. on the one hand, we're seeing concentration in the marketplace. On the other hand, also continuing fragmentation. So fragmentation is kind of analyst speak for in any given market, there can be a lot of different vendors, a lot of different choices. So what does that mean for you? So one thing that's always been prevalent in every version of this map going back to 2008 was this notion of a city center where you've got, major vendors that purport to offer or do offer multiple different solutions. And so each line on the subway goes through them. You've got Salesforce, Oracle, Adobe, Microsoft, Acoustic, which has most of the rump of the IBM solution. And then a little bit further afield, you've got SAP, Sitecore, Optimizely, formerly Episerver, Aprimo, Acoustic, and some others. There has always been this kind of center. I was thrown a little bit, though, when we first put out this map and someone on Twitter said, well, Adobe wins because they have the most subway stations. And I had to say, no. Actually, if you think about this from the customer perspective or the enterprise licensee perspective, which in our world is the only perspective that matters, it's actually a rather different story here. And I think one of the things, the key themes for the past several years, and certainly for 2021, is I think there's a question about whether these major vendors have gotten, in a way, too big and are seeing diminishing or negative returns on scale here. It seems counterintuitive. We disagree with a lot of analysts here, but there are some, if you're going to tell the real story, which is what we're trying to do, then I think there are some hard lessons to learn, which is that if you look in particular at Salesforce, Adobe, and Oracle, to a lesser extent SAP, Acquia, Sitecore, and others, their stacks are often very difficult to navigate. They're a conglomeration of different tools, some of which support B2B, some of which support B2C, some of which are very simple, some of which are very complicated, some of which are very, very industry specific. And so you have these product misdirections. And one common theme is we're talking to the large enterprises that we advise is that very often these platforms have very poor long-term TCO, in part because they tend to be excessively developer intensive for our days. And they often are bringing quietly quite a bit of technical debt that they're having difficulty paying down. And so what should you do as an enterprise technology buyer in this environment? Certainly you may value your current investments as sort of anchor tenants in your MarTech stack. And so there's value that maybe you're anchored around Salesforce CRM, Adobe WCM, Oracle, in terms of some of the marketing cloud that they bring to the table. And that's fine if it's continuing to bring value. I think one of the things that we're really advising our subscribers, though, is looking for opportunities to sometimes replace these solutions with simpler capabilities that are more right-sized for a more kind of agile future. And in particular, don't default to lateral or adjacent solutions from the same vendor just because you already have them in-house. In other words, you shouldn't assume that it's going to be better integrated or it's going to be the right fit for you, and in fact may create even greater sort of lock-in. So the way I described this on Twitter a few years back when we were first kind of leaning into this was, there's no individual technology vendor or no particular technology platform that's going to bring you to the omni-channel future. You need to own your stack. You don't want to outsource your stack to a vendor. You need to own your stack. Some and maybe multiple of these players will be key anchors in your stack, but you need to create and really own your stack and not essentially outsource it to an individual vendor that's going to take you in the direction that it wants to go rather than the direction that you need to go. What's interesting about this, of course, is that there's still, there has not been consolidation as it's been traditionally understood. In other words, in all these different marketplaces, you typically have dozens of different choices. And so the good news is that you don't have to just rely on some of the main vendors. So there has been both concentration and as well as fragmentation. But as our stacks get broader and deeper, and potentially with more players, it brings to mind, well, how do we organize this? Isn't this an integration challenge? How do I rationalize this? And a lot of the work that Real Story Group has been doing, in fact, with our subscribers and clients over the past year, has just been around these kind of rationalization questions. And so our answer to this is really around thinking in terms of a target reference architecture. So a reference architecture is generic kind of abstract model that typically you would want to take and make your own. You can see other webinars that we've produced that go into great detail about what's happening on this busy slide. Basically, you've got engagement channels up top, interaction delivery environments, content and engagement platforms, which is that first kind of colored layer. But when we're thinking about architecture, we think that the way through this kind of morass in the future is focusing on enterprise foundation platforms. These are capabilities that, while not necessarily always centralized, can span multiple channels and are a way of providing universal capabilities that can work in any channel, in any engagement and management environment. It really allows you to have a more customer-centric strategy for the 2020s. And so this is a real change in the stack. It's a change that some of the biggest vendors are not adapting to particularly well. But key among these, obviously, is getting your customer data house in order. So that's the orange and blue boxes below. And then the other piece of this is around operations, that if you really care about creating a cohesive whole around your different technologies, you're going to have to really redouble your investment in marketing operations. And certainly when we look at who among our subscribers have been the most successful, those who have really matured their marketing operations environments really stand out, but also those that have been very clear about breaking out a services architecture and focusing on enterprise-wide components. That's another key precondition, we think, for success in the 2020s. So one way of looking at the world is through that map that we showed you that can be a little bit overwhelming and shows all these different choices. But the other way, of course, is to look at it from an architectural perspective and to really break down your stack and to really focus on what we call Pilates, which is focusing, really pouring more and more attention into capabilities that are going to be cross-channel as opposed to within a single channel. Before we get to the next trend that's kind of underneath the map, I wanted to just remind you that you can feel free to input anything into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time. So you may disagree with something, you may agree with something, you may want to share an anecdote, or you've just got a question that you'd like us to address. We'll definitely have time to do that. So now let's talk about a topic that is near and dear to many of you. We know this. This is the orange line on our subway map, or the customer data platform line, CDP line. This line keeps getting longer. A lot of the stations are under construction. A couple of them have changed names. We're adding more all the time. We're adding a couple more this quarter. Really fascinating marketplace. And so let's look at it from the lens of maybe this is kind of a bellwether around what's happening in MarTech in general. So highly fragmented marketplace. The so-called suite vendors now all have offerings in this marketplace, but they're very late to the game. You probably know that for several years they were really kind of denying the value of this and then jumped in rather belatedly. Our latest research suggests that they're actually a couple of years behind and in many cases are misdirected. So you need to be very careful about defaulting to a CDP player from one of the larger vendors. On the pure play side, there's a lot going on. You've probably seen some M&A activity. That's true. It's been mostly kind of logo name changes rather than consolidation per se. So that's good for you, the customer. So it's not necessarily that there's been a lot of turbulence. There's definitely been some shifting, which we're tracking very closely. We're constantly being persuaded by our subscribers to add new vendors. And so we will be adding new vendors even this quarter and probably next quarter as well to our research. So that's been interesting. And so it's a fascinating marketplace in as much as, again, there's this kind of centrifugal force around the major vendors purporting to have a solution here, but a lot of the energy is happening in a highly fragmented market of pure play platforms. But some patterns are appearing out of the mist. And, one of the patterns that we've been tracking is kind of what's the core focus of the vendor. And, you can kind of put this into three broad cones. Again, these are very broad cones. At the top, primarily activation. So it assumes that you've got your customer data management house in order and all you really want to do is activate that data. Then there are those that focus very heavily on customer data management, almost the kind of customer data fabric in a box down in the lower left. And then there are those that are focused primarily on data analytics or reporting or modeling. And then many that are sort of a combination of the above. You might imagine, hey, why is there no vendor direct in the middle, some sweet spot that does all three? That's not unusual at all. Any vendor that purported to be in the middle, you might wonder whether it was any good at any of them. Don't use this necessarily to build a short list because there are a lot of different ways of slicing and dicing this market, including architecture, cost, complexity, geographic location, vertical, industry support, and any number of different ways you can slice and dice this market, but I think this is one kind of key thing, and suggests to us, again, the primacy of architecture and what is it that you're really looking to do. And this has been one of the more interesting and foundational questions when our CDP research subscribers come to us and they say, well, here's the issues, here's the vendors we're looking at. We want to kind of convert that conversation into talking about architecture and service boundaries and other sorts of things to make sure you're looking at the right swath of vendors. At the end of the day, though, we can produce maps, we can talk about architectures, we can produce logo charts, but the most important thing, of course, is what are you actually trying to do with this technology? So in every one of our marketplaces, across each one of those subway lines, when we go in and do these deep dive evaluations of the vendors, we do it through the lens of canonical use cases or scenarios. In other words, we evaluate the vendor to what extent does it try to solve this particular problem. And that's the way you should look at it too. So this allows us to compare presumably diverse CDP vendors using a common kind of analytical lens. And these are the 10 potential CDP use cases. There's no vendor that's good at all 10 of these. In fact, arguably the typical vendor isn't particularly excellent at more than 2 to 4 of these, can maybe talk around 2 or 3 others. That's okay. Again, you don't necessarily want a master of many here. But the key thing is for you to sort of understand, hey, what's our emphasis? What are we trying to support? And then you can match up, more clearly against the marketplace. That's what we do in our research. And that's what I encourage you to do, whether you work with us or not. Okay. Moving on quickly here, I see we're getting a lot of questions and comments. That's wonderful. Jim and Peter and Scott and everyone else, we're going to have time to get to those. So thanks for typing in. Any of you else who have more questions or comments, feel free to put them in. Next, I want to turn briefly to a couple of the older lines. In fact, these are some of the original lines on the subway map, going back to 2008, really going back to 2001 when we formed the company. Web content management and DAM. We're continuing to see a quiet but really pervasive, important evolution in both marketplaces. I'll take a lens first at the WCM marketplace, which has really in the last couple of years gotten a little bit compressed. So this is a maturing marketplace. Again, a highly, highly fragmented marketplace. That's good. More mature marketplaces you can typically view through the lens of a complexity spectrum. Now, complexity spectrum is not making subjective judgments. It's just saying that some solutions are more are more sophisticated, more complex, more expensive. Others are simpler, more accessible, less expensive, which is the right fit for you. We tend to have found over the last 2 decades that enterprises will tend to overbuy more than they underbuy. So we always encourage people, hey, look a little to the right here and not just always to the left. But there are some key trends. These trends have been happening for a couple of years. I'm not suggesting that any of them are necessarily novel for 2021, but there's something to keep in mind if you're looking at WCM or, for that matter, digital asset management, where many of the same dynamics are taking place, which is there's real pressure at the top tier of the market. There's a lot of questions about whether toolkits and even some of the upper range solutions are over-engineered and have too much technical debt. Certainly, we see a lot of technical debt in the so-called legacy solutions in the lower left, which are typically platforms that you would leave rather than license afresh. There's also a lot of pressure on the bottom tier of the market from the likes of Squarespace and other kind of site builders. So we've actually removed a whole swath of 6 or 7 really simple vendors that, have some staying power, but are largely, out of the picture. Still a lot of competition around usability, architecture, and the kind of operational services that you align with. We're seeing a lot of more modern approaches where the WCM has externalized segmentation and personalization, other things that used to be embedded in WCM, now you want from an enterprise level. Again, going back to architecture, really important there. Renewed interest in structured content management. However, many of these platforms aren't particularly good at structured content management, A, and B, often have weak digital asset management subsystems. So using your WCM as an omni-channel platform still remains a little bit of a hurdle there. And then traditional analyst firms really missing, to a large extent, the full breadth of this highly fragmented marketplace. So the good news is you have a lot of choices. Other good news, this marketplace is maturing. Bad news, many of you are still, I would say, over-investing and over-complexifying your environment here at a time where you should probably be moving more services lower in your stack. Digital asset management, very similar story, highly mature marketplace, highly fragmented marketplace, a lot of pressure on the vendors across the board. That's good for you. And a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice them to get the right choice. Now let's talk about the newest line on our subway map, the brown line, and the rise of personalization platforms. Now, personalization, of course, has been with us really for 25 years. Since the dawn of the web, people have been trying to personalize experiences. For 2 decades plus, that has been more often than not an exercise in frustration, I think, on both sides of the screen. And here's an example from my colleague Apoor of the sort of thing that I think many of you have seen. We all joke about, Amazon trying to tell me that there's some similar items here, a gas grill starter and an almond. Unless I'm trying to roast my almonds with one of those, I'm not sure how they relate to it. And then this guy here, a very funny story about some roses were out of stock, and so he thought, well, maybe he got pushed by Whole Foods to buy his wife maybe a red bell pepper instead. Probably not good for his marriage there, but we can joke about these, but we've all lived these, and it's not just in terms of the recommendation engine. There's all kinds of challenges with personalization, not the least of which is multi-channel, let alone omni-channel personalization, where many of you are struggling with. And, the answer that the industry is emerging is that personalization probably deserves its own layer in your stack and maybe its own set of capabilities and its own platform, therefore, that's disconnected from some of your other systems, but closely tied to your customer data so that it can deliver A, a more accurate experience, and B, potentially a more omni-channel experience. So, we are going to be releasing in the next several weeks our evaluations. Again, it'll be scenario-based. Again, it'll be hard-hitting, critical evaluations of some of the major players here. Again, it's an interesting marketplace where you have some legacy solutions among the larger name vendors and then some interesting newer upstarts here that offer some interesting capabilities, albeit maybe not always as mature as you would like. And so we expect this subway line to grow as well, but really excited to be sharing some of this, and you can look out for a future webinar around this. If you're already a Real Story Group subscriber, full subscriber, you'll get access to all of this research as part of your subscription. So excited about sharing that with you. Speaking of sharing with you, our mission in life is really to support MarTech stack leaders. We call this Stacy the stack owner, and Stacy the stack owner. If that's you, then my respect and sometimes my condolences. You lead a very complicated life. We know this because we work with you every day. And our mission in life is to try to create a shield to help you focus on the things that are important, and then we can help you answer all of the strategic and technical questions. Maybe not all of them, but some of the more pressing questions to help you make better decisions. That's really our mission in life. And so if you're looking for that kind of support, there's 3 different ways that we can help you. One is through vendor selection advisory, where you get access to self-service tools, including building dynamic real quadrants based on your requirements, not what some analyst firm says. And then get to a short list and then get really hard-hitting research about not just the strengths of these vendors, but what are their often hidden weaknesses. Some larger enterprise to subscribe to the entire stack of our research, and then we advise them on their stack strategies. And then a subset of those have joined our private peer-level council, which meets every other month to share lessons and share stories and help each other out. Really neat way for stack leaders to help guide us in terms of our research and also guide each other in terms of being successful professionals in this very difficult but also exciting environment. So with that, I see a lot of questions have come in. Scott, if you want to just say a few words about next steps, and then we'll definitely get to all of your questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And if any of you want to see a behind-the-scenes tour of Real Story Group's customer experience, just reach out to us, explore@realstorygroup.com, and I'd be happy to schedule some time with you to talk through that, and also give you some more details about that Stack Leadership Council. Our next meeting is scheduled to be in mid-June, and Always interesting to talk with folks about potentially joining. So please let us know if that's of interest to you, and always encourage you to download excerpts from any or all the research areas that Tony touched on today. So you can do that at realstorygroup.com/try. With that, you're right, Tony, there are a number of questions. So I'll let you take it away with those.
So specifically from, we've got Jim, can you talk a little bit about chatbots and virtual agents? Well, we cover this technology per se, but what I would say is it's yet another kind of experience place and a new capability and venue that's facing prospects and customers. And so what you want to ideally do is plug that into an architecture of these core foundation services, rather than have those become yet another mini MarTech stack in a box with their own decision making, their own corpus of content, their own customer data store. You know, it's just, that's going to complicate your life. What you really want is to build this foundation where you have foundational content, foundational decisioning, foundational data, and then you plug in, whether it's chatbot, virtual agents, or anything else on top of that, and you only select tools that can work with your foundational capabilities. Speaking of M&A, could you speak to this is Peter asking, speak to the recent Highland Nuxio acquisition, how you think that might affect their DAM capabilities. You know, Nuxio's been an interesting company. They've kind of meandered over the years. They were an ECM vendor, then they were a DAM vendor, then they went back to being an ECM vendor. I think basically Nuxio just ran out of steam. It was a venture-funded company. Sometimes venture capitalists get itchy fingers, and it just basically kind of ran out of runway. It's certainly a very plausible platform. I don't think it's the acquisition by Highland means a whole lot with respect to the DAM marketplace as a whole, and I would expect that Highland will be a responsible owner of the Nuxio platform, but I don't expect a lot of innovation going forward. Scott said, I'm not sure I agree the big guys are a couple years behind. As large as they are, with a strong focus on developing a CSV, they will most likely be able to catch up more quickly than that, especially those that already have a strong foundation on omnichannel publishing and analytics. Well, Scott, I think we're just going to agree to disagree here. You know, we've seen the earlier versions of some of these platforms, and I think that they have two challenges. One is, you know, just the R&D to catch up, but secondly, you know, it's very difficult for them to extract customer data management from some of their existing investments, and I think there's a lot of internal disputes going on with these vendors too. But time will tell, and you're right, I could be wrong about that. Jim's saying, how important it is to have integrated engagement channels, given your comment about not going with the same large vendors? Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to integration is really focusing again on your foundation. I'm not trying to trivialize the integration issues. It is the number one issue with your MarTech stack, whether you go all in with Oracle or whether you have more of a best-of-breed strategy, or for most of you something in between. Integration is always going to be a foundational challenge, and I think the way out of that is to make sure that you then build some foundational capabilities around data management, decisioning, and content management. Sahum is asking, do you see any of your clients bypassing CDPs altogether? How about the rise of modern data warehouses influence this? No, we don't see people bypassing CDPs. CDPs really need to coexist with a larger customer data fabric, which may or may not be built in a modern environment like Snowflake, Google BigQuery, or Amazon Redshift. And so CDPs are more properly understood as a piece of the puzzle. This just happens to be a very important piece of the puzzle because that's where data gets managed and activated from a marketing context. So, you know, I think that there's a both and there rather than an either or. Craig is asking, you mentioned it can be beneficial for some enterprises to consider simpler solutions. Are you seeing any move by big player vendors to rethink their patchwork product suite where individual products may have been acquired? I don't see them. I don't see the big vendors rethinking this strategy. I think that they're going to continue to make other acquisitions and just get bigger and bigger and broader and broader. And, you know, at some point, we're going to have to ask the question, are they really just struggling under their own weight? Jennifer's asking, talk about the reasons around renewed interest in structured content for multi-channel distribution with the WCN. Well, I think it really goes to, you know, that, again, that architecture diagram, Jennifer, we had all of these different channels, including, you know, that great question earlier about chatbots. So where does the content come from, the chatbot? And people are starting to think around this in an omni-channel context and not just, you know, content going to my WCN. Another great example is content going to my interactive applications where more people may be showing up rather than at my website. And so the question then comes, can my WCN be the platform to do that? And for many of you, the answer is going to be no. Scott's asking, why do we have Drupal and Acquia into different WCM categories? Well, Acquia obviously has a huge footprint in the enterprise Drupal environment, but we've also seen quite properly a lot of backlash against Acquia, and there's a huge Drupal community outside of that. There's potential forking going on. There's just a lot going on there. So that's one. Scott's a little bit of exception to the rule. Let's see. Alexander's asking, for a person from Europe working in the public sector, university focus on marketing is still not common. A lot of is very information focused. Well, there's a lot here. So Alexander's asking about basically the product segment of the WCM market that we lopped off. And, we simply just got fewer and fewer inquiries. Many of those vendors did focus on higher ed, the area where you work in, and so that's a great niche for those vendors. Squarespace may never make an inroad into there, but Squarespace is kind of knocking them out of almost every other environment. So higher ed continues, I think, to support a number of very product-focused WCM platforms, and I think that's a good thing for both. James is asking an interesting question. Are there any types of tools you recommend organizations build instead of buy? And I think that, it's a really interesting question. We tend to be biased towards buy rather than build. I think there are certain foundational elements around certainly analytics and other forms of core data management that live underneath or next to a CDP that inevitably you're going to have to build tool sets rather than just buy off the shelf. Michelle is asking, what's your take on sales enablement tools? That's a great question. We could almost do a whole sales stack, Michelle, that lives side but kind of overlapping with the marketing stack. And so sales enablement tools are really interesting because, again, they call the question on, sales enablement tools often have content management. They often do outbound marketing. They often do content assembly. They often have data and decisioning. You're like, okay, should I wrap this up in my sales silo and jam this all around Salesforce or HubSpot, or should I abstract some of these capabilities and feed a sales enablement tool, these sorts of things? So once again, I think fundamentally it's an architectural question. What are my thoughts on Acquia's purchase of Binder and their move towards DAM? Well, I think, Acquia acquires a lot of stuff. They haven't done necessarily a great job of integrating them all. I think the further will they get away from Drupal, the less sense it makes for them even as a WCM player. So Acquia is a little bit of an unusual hybrid to me, and a great example of how some of these companies are almost kind of fake Frankenstein companies from a customer perspective. From an investor perspective, maybe it makes sense. Investors give them money and they make acquisitions. From a customer perspective, I'm really not sure. Let's see. Let's see. Greg, one last question. Where do you see rights management fitting on the map? It's a great question. It's one of those kind of adjacent, niche technologies of which there are hundreds that we could plug in. And, that's the whole point of that reference model, is that for some of you, you probably would want to change the colors. And we work with our subscribers to take that generic reference model and then modify it for their unique circumstances. And for some of you, rights management might be huge. Typically we see that adjacent or antecedent or even within digital asset management. Arguably, rights management lives kind of beyond that, but it often tends to travel with digital asset management. And for many of you, is a really key piece of your digital asset management puzzle. Aaron is asking, Sitecore is also making a lot of acquisitions. The path to avoid the challenges you shared about Acquia, so Sitecore, I think, ran into a little bit of a dead end with its WCM. They raised a bunch of money and they're going to have to figure out what to do. We've published quite a bit about Sitecore. They're having to undergo a very fundamental transformation, and that's a high-risk play for them. It's a high-risk play for their channel, and it's a high-risk play for their licensees. So we'll see what happens. I can't say that we're one of the more optimistic observers, but hopefully they'll prove us wrong because, Sitecore has a significant market share and a lot of customers that are relying on them. So that was a lot. We went 5 minutes over. Thanks for hanging out with us. Feel free to reach out at any of these coordinates that you see on the screen for any follow-up questions. As always, you can rely on us as you're looking to make the right stack decisions for your enterprise. So thanks again for spending 35 minutes of your day or evening with us. And on behalf of Scott Dill, this is Tony Burns saying so long until next time. Bye now.